Get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for coming. Yes, especially on a Friday afternoon. I'm Connie. I'm a graduate student in the Department of Linguistics at McGill. This is a very special event within our McGill Linguistics Colloquium series, and it's being co-sponsored by the Linguistics Department, the Faculty of Arts, the Arts Undergraduate Society, and the Society for Linguistics Undergraduates at McGill. So we have a lot of people to thank, and we're very happy that we were able to promote the event so widely. Before we get into introductions, I just want to remind everyone to please keep yourself muted during the talk. At the very end, we'll have a Q&A period where you'll be able to type in the chat or use the raise hand function to ask questions, and we'll monitor those as they come in. Okay, great, then let's get started. To start us off with some opening remarks, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Terry Givens, who is a professor in the Department of Political Science here at McGill. Terry is also the Provost's academic lead and advisor on McGill's action plan to address anti-Black racism, and will be able to tell us more about some of the wider initiatives taking place here and how the importance of language ties into these topics. So I will turn it over to you, Terry.
Thank you so much. Bonjour, bienvenue à tous. And I'm using my French just a little bit today because, of course, the language is such an important issue here in Quebec. And also, I am a Francophile, so I need to be speaking French more often. But in any case, I'm very happy to be here today, and it's my pleasure to make a few remarks and talk about the McGill strategy to address anti-Black racism. It's a strategy that goes across the campus, not only in terms of the different faculties, but also in terms of the different components. And one of the things I think that is really important is that we are creating a really institutionalized approach to anti-racism. That means that we have staff who are working in everything from the admissions process to recruitment of students to wellness and athletics, all the way up to alumni. And so we are really trying to do something that is going to change the culture of McGill to make it a place that is more welcoming to Black faculty, students, and staff. And I'm really happy to be partnering with the Black Caucus, the Black Faculty and Staff Caucus here at McGill. They've been there since many of them since the beginning of trying to get change at McGill. And also I want to give a shout out to the students who were an important component of getting this strategy moved forward. And I'm very happy to say that we've been making great progress on recruiting Black faculty. And I'm one of them who was recruited through the strategy. So in any case, it's my pleasure to be here today, and I'm really looking forward to this talk, and I hope everybody has a great time and we listen to and learn about linguistics and the importance of Black language and how we can use it to improve the situation for students and beyond. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so thanks so much, Terry, and thanks everybody for coming. And I'm really happy to get to introduce Dr. Ann Charity Hudley, whose work really touches directly on a lot of the work that's happening here at McGill that Terry just mentioned. So Dr. Charity Hudley is a professor of education, African American studies, and linguistics at Stanford University, where she co-leads the Black Academic Development Lab, or BAD Lab, whose mission is to, quote, integrate linguistic research with educational praxis and create a model of scholarship for dissemination. And this mission connects to a larger aim that's seen throughout her body of work of using linguistics to address issues of racial and educational equity and inclusion. She's done pioneering work in the importance of understanding language variation in K-12 educational settings and has 2 published books on this topic. And then in more recent work, she's worked to extend this into post-secondary university settings, which is also the focus of some of her journal publications and an upcoming co-authored book, Talking College, Making Space for Black Language Practices in Higher Education. Another focus of her research and practice has been in expanding access to linguistics for Black undergraduate students. And this work focuses on building inclusive and equitable policies in education. Sorry, something just popped up in Zoom. Okay, in education, especially for Black students who, as we know, are underrepresented both in higher education and in the fields of linguistics in particular. You can learn more about this and other work of hers on her website, where you'll also find a link to her Duolingo video, Black Languages Matter, which I highly recommend. And she's been recognized by numerous organizations and societies for all of her work and achievements. So she was a co-author on the paper, Attracting Black Students to Linguistics through a Black-Centered Introduction to Linguistics course, which won the Best Paper Award for the journal Language. She's also a fellow of the Linguistic Society of America, and more recently was inducted as a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Anne Charity Hudley.
Y'all, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be with you all virtually. I cannot wait to be back in person. I welcome an active chat. Send me messages and I'll respond, especially if I can't do it during the talk, during the Q&A, but as questions come up, go ahead and send them. That helps us think. Dr. Christine Mallinson is on the call, so she may be responding to questions for links and references as we go along. So I want to let you all know that that may happen. So let's do this. The context of having Terry and Jessica work together to give this talk under the themes of what linguistics can do to inform the anti-Black racism efforts on campus is what this work is all about. And so this is a particular honor to bring together people who are interested in these issues from different angles. I've been doing this my whole life in a split between linguistics and Black studies, very, front forward. Those are things that I'm interested in. But I had the privilege of going to an independent school in Virginia where you learn French as just part of being there. So I actually worked on questions of Montreal French in the big corpus. It's the 50th anniversary this year for the first 2 years of graduate school. So some of you all may have seen me in some of my first talks. Some of them were in English, some of them were in French, some of them were both. And so we can think about those connections because that's kind of the conversation, how this started for me as a scholar, thinking about what was going on in Canada, what was going on in the US. My particular interest in Canada also spun from family of mine who moved to Canada to escape the Jim Crow South, and they live there to this day, right? So thinking about those intersections for me was always material and real to this work. I want to shout out the Talking College team. Some of them are here and some of them will pop in as they go. You can find out more about our previous work at UCSB HBCU Ling and our new website. If you type in Bad Lab Stanford, you can see the whole crew. So for me, this conversation with you all in particular and what we're doing now across these large research universities is to have a conversation about how do we do invitation in rather than just a report out. So I'm going to talk about my research, of course, but I'm talking about how do we get this conversation to be broader and our models to be more dynamic across our campuses. And the frame that I love for this is a poem by Lucille Clifton, who says, really, this is a celebration. Won't you celebrate with me the life that I have shaped out of no model, born in Babylon, so relevant to linguistics, both non-white and woman. What did I see to be except myself? I made it up here on this bridge between starshine and clay, one hand holding tight my other hand. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. And I think it's such a good way of thinking about the experiences of Black students and Black faculty in really dominant, predominantly white universities and contexts in particular, because so much change has to happen so that the ideas, the models that I'm going to share with you become part of our discourse. And this discourse, which has been so dominant, can slowly fade away. So my model rests on community-based participatory research methodologies. And I am completely dedicated to thinking about this in the context of structural change. I'm thinking about structural change that is immediate. I want to see educators who want to become policymakers, and that's faculty, that's kindergarten teachers, that's people who are throughout the system. I'm looking at students on this call and I'm thinking about when they're full professors at Stanford, when they're full professors at McGill, so that we can really make the model immediate and attentive to community needs and community culture. Really important for that for me is I want to know who you as students and educators want to be, so we can try to really have a specific line to how we get there. So if I think about this in the university research context, some of you all are linguists, which is awesome, but this work really goes across broadly, not just the social sciences, but the sciences and humanities. And so developing a model for this conversation has been important. Now, my work here in the United States has really been funded heavily by the National Science Foundation with support from the National Institute of Health and other big bodies. Ford Foundation in the United States, Mellon, these are large post-corporate type foundation models. And they have pushed a model of increasing participation, also known as broadening participation. That is to say, we go forth with the science and we try to find people from different backgrounds who will start and join us. But a critique of the STEM model, while it has been somewhat successful, is that it is really largely dominantly assimilatory. That is, I find a student who wants to do the kind of linguistics that I do. I find people who are interested in asking maybe similar questions and applying them maybe to their racial group or their community, but not necessarily formatively changing the question. That's why for me, the partnership model, the ways that we work with neighboring disciplines who are kind of outside of that STEM social science model. And often we find those scholars in ethnic studies departments, racial, gender studies programs. So we work with those scholars to push our questions, push our models, and to create truly interdisciplinary approaches to thinking about these larger research inclusion questions. What we're saying with this work is that we are a little past that model and really looking at a racial and cultural value model. We're emphasizing social justice, and we're emphasizing the intellectual values of scholars who are presently in linguistics, in our case, from underrepresented groups. And we're saying directly, what would you like to study? What questions do you have? How would you do this research differently in service of Black people and in Black lives? And to do that, we have to look at the structural realities about where our intellectual interests coincide with or smash up against white supremacy. And so one of the things that we've thought about a lot is that racism, especially in higher education, is couched in pragmatic arguments. Pragmatic arguments about reputation, pragmatic conversations about budgets and majority wishes. So what would be the good thing for most people at a university or most people in a department? And we want to ask back, these are questions about power, right? The real question is, who has power in the academy? Or more diffusely, like, do we even know? And so to make that specifically, we can think about who edits our journals, who runs our organizations, who decides on the conference talks and the invited speakers, who awards the grants and who donates the money, right? And this has to be part of the conversation as we move through the academy so that we don't use our own willful ignorance in a critical race theory model to avoid our complicitness or our participation in these broader questions. And this is really important as we think about what kind of higher education we want for the future and the kind of higher education we want for our students. And right now here at Stanford, I got so many Black graduate students in one program. I never even thought it was possible, right? I never imagined across linguistics and education and linguistics here, we would have so many students at one time at a super high ranked university. And so I wake up every day and go to sleep every night thinking about what will they do next. So Christine Mounson, who's on the call, Mary Buckles and I started to really think about how this relates to linguistics and related areas and where we in a positionality model take our identity, but also our structural reality into the academy as part of the conversation. So this is another way of really thinking about how you see your own positionality and your intentionality. So many people may identify, especially if you're rolling up here on a Friday afternoon, as a graduate student, newer professors, super progressive people who are out here teaching, researching, and serving for justice, right? And so Mary Buckles says right there, who are our allies? Like, we're looking for those people to be in conversation and to work with. But there's a lot of other people that's kind of swirl around this, and we find ourselves passing through this reality in different ways. We have people who are pre-tenure, and for people from minoritized backgrounds, people who are in this position of always being challenged in their reviews, right? There's always an issue to be found with our work. There's always an issue to be found with our record that goes along with the model. Martin Luther King put this in the framework of, always really thinking about that moderate white liberal who who doesn't make so much noise, but doesn't make so much change, and the challenges that you face in making change in universities, I would say with that group. And that group aligned in university models for me are faculty who are just happy to have a job and just happy to do what they do. They're like, look, I don't know, trying to get in all of this. I'm just glad I got this job. This was the one job I got, and I get up every day, I do my work, and I teach, right? And so we could look at the material challenges with people who either follow those sentiments or feel trapped by them as well. That's really important because we have to think about how discrimination and even inappropriate behavior can be handled in light of people who are either really invested in thinking they're smart or people who are just being lazily, willfully ignorant. They know that they can get through their day and with no changes, they'll be fine. So staying around this, we have people who are then mitigating their risk, altering their route to non-faculty positions, they're leaving academia. This is really important as we think about our model. And we have the power elite. In many places that we've been, we know that there are faculty who have monetized their careers. They're able to make political decisions across the university and their constituencies, and they have a reason to maintain their elite status or their top of the heap power dynamic. Running alongside those, I contend, we have to be aware of those who are jockeying for that elite status. And sometimes, especially in this era of pandemic and protest, those scholars are actually co-opting progressive causes, right? And so this larger landscape, if I think about the language and culture of Black students on campuses and how we got to where we are, this is super important for us to bring into the discourse of our scholarship and of our everyday life. So these conversations are going on across the world. And I just want to give you one model in the United States for my colleagues at Georgetown, who I've been in conversation with quite deeply about this and how reparations is kind of starting or going in that area. So Georgetown students, that's really important to think about. Students themselves created a fund to help fund descendants of formerly enslaved people at Georgetown. And so you see even student activism kind of coming into these models of reparation that are immediate and directly related to the people for whom harm has done. And I think every university is going to have to start building out those immediate models and then the ones that come over that. So for me, what does reparations look like? And I always like this picture because I took it one day when everything in my research lab back at the College of William and Mary was just going right. There was a mix of students and faculty, and then we were across areas and disciplines. There's a biology professor in the picture, a theater professor in the picture, and scholars who have gone on to just do amazing things as researchers and professors. But for me, this reparations is real. It was the backs of people from my own family who I know, formerly enslaved and in the post-slave era, who built this university. And so a lot of people wonder, Ann, why did you go to William and Mary? I was like, that was my reparations. It's the closest to reparations materially that I was ever going to see in this lifetime, to marshal those resources and those energy in service of the students and descendants of those formerly enslaved people. And so this is one of my former students, Ebony Brown, holding the chalice at William and Mary as our student body president, as a local Black resident, who, by the way, to be able to hold the chalice and walk through that door in a way that holds dignity, we had to take the Confederate flag off of some of the emblems, right? So this is how close this is in terms of thinking about the direct, unbroken nature of what I mean when I'm talking about reparations. So in linguistics, we have some precursors to this. We have my own dissertation advisor, William LeBeau, saying that if you've obtained data from members of a speech community, you have an obligation to use that knowledge for the benefit of the community who has need of it, right? So that's coming from a principle of debt incurred model. Added to that, LeBeau updated and added the idea of the principle of error correction. So if you're a scientist and you become aware of a widespread idea or social practice with important consequences that your data can bring to bear on, you have an obligation to bring this information to the widest attention possible. So this is kind of where I ended the scene reading this. I was like, okay, I'm gonna go here and do that, right? And this is kind of how I got in this conversation. And then this is also tied to models from Walt Wolfram, where Christine and I kind of came together the idea is that we actively should pursue ways that we can return linguistic knowledge to communities. And that's what Walt has been materially involved in for the better part of his career. And Rickford brings to this question, John Rickford, the idea that American quantitative sociolinguistics in particular, some of the most scientifically supported and funded work, has relied substantially on information from African-American vernacular English and African-American communities, not just for the particulars of that community, but for the basic theory and modeling that sociolinguistics uses on a daily basis, right? And so the imperative to give back to African-Americans, Rickford says, is particular in this reparations model. So I am really invested in this work because I'm looking at how do we recognize that material and intellectual profit? And how do we return that knowledge, but not ignore, as Ta-Nehisi Coates reminds us, the long tradition of the United States actively punishing Black success, right? Such that when we bring our interests and values to the model, even in the best case scenario, those punishment models are also built in to the United States model, but also into the models of the university. So we got to think about what would reparations look like in linguistics and broadly defined in our universities. And how do we adapt our model from linguistics and the conversations that we've been having over the last couple of generations to other communities in ways that make sense? And so we've been convening scholars to really talk about this. And we've been talking directly about racism in linguistics as part of this, right? So we have the models for campus and community, but we've got disciplinary challenges as well. And so we argue that one of the reasons why these issues are still out there is we haven't addressed racism in linguistics. And so we really have been writing a lot about how to open up pathways for future linguists and thinking about backgrounds and perspectives. And that really is what led us to the Linguistics Society of America's statement on race, and also the set of papers that accompany it, thinking about racial models in linguistics. All of this is going along as I'm still doing work with Christine on Black language and education across the lifespan. So we're starting with pre-kindergartners, and we're thinking about the reality of how is this Black student experiencing education in the United States, linguistically, culturally, socially, racially, all these intersections, starting then into the secondary English curriculum, then taking a detour when we got there, because we realized if I don't talk about undergraduate research, I'm not going to have any researchers to do this work with me in the short and long term. And then that led us into the Talking College project that I'm going to spend most of the rest of today focusing on. So what do? We do theoretical modeling, even in some of what we've just done, but we also do methodological expansion so that we can really center in on practical application. And so that immediacy, right, has to then become part of our method. And so I'm going to focus a lot on how we kind of really thought of that material method. How do we bring this reparations model into the linguistic methods that we decide to privilege? Fundamental question, the theoretical question is still the same. How do I value a student's home language, a home variety, and their cultural background, and build on it? I want to make my students feel more empowered to learn more about their home languages, their home varieties, and their backgrounds, while I'm helping them learn standardized English. So that's my fundamental question. We built aspects to the model that are really centered in the humanistic social sciences for us. I'm going to have a focus on pedagogy, dialogue, conversations like the ones we're having today, and partnership. And to make this knowledge usable, we really have focused in on collaborative observations, surveys, interviews, and partnerships with educators to develop research-based strategies that people can integrate back into their communities. And so this is some of the educators who've worked with us for years. And the whole idea is like, bring your students into the mix, take it back to the classrooms, whether it be kindergarten or college. Let us know what's going on, what works, how do we tweak it, and how do we keep this thing going, maybe larger, but also iterative. And to do that, we use a framework of deserving. So we are face forward in saying our work is really for Black college students, undergrads, high and graduate students, postgraduate students, right? And this is a photo from one of our visits at Norfolk State University, where one of the students there just said to us, Can you imagine if a lot of students knew more about African-American language and culture? What would that really do? And so we really privileged that question from that early first cohort of students across this partnership to say, you know what, that's what we got to focus on, scholarship of dissemination, something that makes that real. And who we do it for is specific for us. We are doing this for our families. We are doing this for our communities, and educators who research language, we say, really have to adopt a framework that includes that language and social justice framework that is specific. I need my findings to be relevant. I need my findings to be replicable, because I have with me 2 of my own nieces here at Stanford. So I need to make their experience at this university better in real time. And that will then serve to make the model stronger for others. And so what we're doing here is thinking about this in a concentrated model is what intellectual questions arise when there's a concentration of Black scholars, when there's a concentration of Black community, when there's a concentration of Black family in one place. The question that I think is most important, what linguistic scholarship goes beyond the limits of current white knowledge, right? And so thinking about how language is an essential aspect of African-American culture and heritage, that's been established in linguistics. But asking that particular question to our communities, to our families, that's what's going to push our scholarship ahead. So our key research questions from the Talking College then follow just what is the sociolinguistic nature of African-American English on college campuses? How do speakers navigate their choices? What biases do they face? How do they really think about the way that language plays a role in the social mobility of undergraduate students, particularly their own perceptions and pathways of obstacles to the mobility in higher education, and the ways their spoken, written, signed, and embodied communication play a role in how they're viewed, how they're received, how they're educated, and sometimes our students report how they're surveilled, right, on these campuses, depending on the context. This definitely overlaps with racial identity development, with language development, just in general ways that we think about this, and the ideas between acquisition, perception, and our lived realities. So I talk a lot with students about the idea that I went to a predominantly white K-12 school, partly because my parents wanted me to integrate that school. The linguistic reality of that integration act meant that I may want to sound Black all day, but to certain people, I sound more white. My K-12 experience rendered me sounding that way, whether I wanted to or not. And so I have different lens on what choices I then make about racial linguistic identity and performance. So to bring those types of questions and realities in, we actively weave together the personal and the intellectual in the portraits and the interview work that we did in this project. And these combinations of the stories of the people who are doing the research and the interviewers, the student participants, and we ourselves become a new way to reframe the sociolinguistic interview, right? So the individual narrative, my story, my student stories, my co-author stories, is never disembodied from this work. And the individual then is really more fully woven into the collection, right? And so the sum of these narratives, the sum of the experiences, it is the triangulation of our lived experiences. And for us, the way that we think about decolonizing the sociolinguistic interview is that this work is for us and it is by us. So here's the model more generally, and a lot of the book is devoted to fleshing it out, giving ethnographic and interview examples, thinking about the ways you can have conversations about this. But I'll just go over it and I'll give you examples of some of these so you get a taste of this within the larger context of the project. So talking to students all around, we really found students who speak or identify as speaking African-American English, and they're still grappling with standardized English, and they know it. It's really showing up in the ways that they're moving through educational space, in their writing, in their experiences in classrooms and in communities and on the college campuses. We have students who speak African-American English and they're unbothered. They really are like, this is who I am, this is what I do, this university can figure out, and the people in it, what they want to do with it. We have students who are amazing users of African-American English and are amazing at standardized English. And we really document how those students move through time and space in ways that marshal their authentic identities, but also really are successful in higher education. We profile students who speak standardized English and speak some African-American English and understand it, and others who speak standardized English and know African-American English, but they ain't really trying to admit it. And that's for a lot of different reasons. You just may not identify, you may not agree, and we really value all of these different perspectives. And we also have a focus on students who speak standardized English and they don't know African-American English, and they may really want to, but again, their social cultural backgrounds and histories may have made that real. And so these categories for us are not fixed. They're actually really fluid across not just a person's lifetime or experience, but across your day. Because one of the things we think about is these social categories and characteristics are also in flux with linguistic features, both internal and external. So there's different dimensions of how this may manifest if I'm listening to someone's overall intonation, if I'm thinking about their grammatical patterns, the ways that they express themselves in writing and in rhetoric. And students are able to detail that for us, right? So there's certain things that they may really feel like they are not going to change in their expression of their self and their African-American language. And there's other things that they might not really think about or have a large social weight as they're making those distinctions. But they may really be aware of other people around them who are perceiving or producing those features and having different sociological and cultural outcomes. So one of our amazing graduate students on the project, Doza, did this graphic to kind of show that this is not linear, it's not progressive, there's no value judgment in terms of that, because we know that all of these things are in swirl all of the time. So here's an example, and this is some of the students in our project who did some of these amazing interviews. And I picked this one as students who speak African-American English and they're unbothered, right? So that doesn't mean they're not conscious of all of the dynamics in higher ed. They just have a narration around their linguistic use. These students are often proud of their language and they're often oppositional to dominant structures. They recognize that you got to go to these schools to get your paper. And when we say paper, we're talking about your degree and your ability to make money after you graduate. But they're not really interested in ideas or rhetorics about assimilation to a dominant norm. And their Blackness may be really pronounced. So here's an example of one such student. Someone who believes in the politics of academia, or someone who believes this is going to change my life. This is going to help the world. You know what I'm saying? Those who invested in the politics of academia in its fullest sense. Yes, if I were that person, I would say, yes, I do have to change how I speak or how I look or whatever. But they're going to treat me like a nigga regardless. So I might as well act, I'm sorry, they're going to treat me like a Black regardless. So it's just like, why do the most? I'm literally sitting here having to shove myself into a box for what? Like they're going to see my bald head and be like, look at this bitch. You know what I'm saying? It doesn't matter. To me personally, and that's just because I think in high school, I tried to act or speak accordingly to what people think is correct, which is just how white people speak. And then I realized that it really does not make a difference, at least in my experience. I don't think I have to. But you know, when I write essays, do I write grammatically correct? Sure. But you know what I'm saying, right? So the student is recognizing what is materially important to get through college, but has a whole different rhetoric about the racial linguistic realities of what different people might act or expect for them to do. Here's an example of students who speak standardized English and don't know African-American English, right? And this one I picked because this project really did have student researchers, participants, and interviews from across the Black diaspora. So we had students who identified throughout the Caribbean and throughout all different areas of Africa as part of our researchers and in this narrative. And part of this is we wanted to make our diaspora more whole. So one student says, well, if I'm with my friends, I'll use more slang. Or if I'm with like certain types of people, I would say more like certain types of slang. They're like if I'm with my friends, my Black friends, my slang is a little different than if I was just with my non-Black friends, right? So this student is trying to make ideas about what's going on. They can hear it, but they're not quite sure about the whole system of African-American language and culture yet. So they're still seeing this as slang that is beneficial. And here's another student saying, I feel like there's just a whole subset of slang that like Black people use or start before it becomes like general slang that everyone uses. So I feel like I might be using those kinds of words with Black friends before they maybe even become like everyone else uses, right? So they're negotiating that linguistic sense, that racial sense, and often that new identity of being Black or African-American in the United States since as part of these processes. And they go on to talk about, their comfort or discomfort or embracement with that. And again, not generally, but in particular situations and in particular linguistic contexts. We have students who speak standardized English and don't know African-American English. And this is another, I chose, especially in the Canadian context, another scholar from the Black diaspora who sees themselves as a learner of African-American English, but is still grappling again with this linguistic and racialized identity that they've assumed as a student, a graduate student at a predominantly white institution in the Northeast United States. And the student says, I haven't always been as comfortable with my voice as I am now. I think if you had interviewed me right out of college, I don't know that I would have said the same thing I'm saying now. I think the biggest way it affected me is it made me feel like those people are not safe, right? She's talking about the people who can't have conversations materially with her about these issues. For me to develop relationships that are trusting and vulnerable, because if I see that you hold these kind of opinions that minimize or delegitimize my experiences as a Black person or as a Black woman, and I'm not gonna feel comfortable developing a relationship with you if I can't share the challenges I face. I'm not going to talk to you about why it's so difficult for me to feel like I have to prove myself in every classroom. Because a lot of times I'm one or two in situations and I know I'm being judged for how I look and how I talk and how I dress and my research agenda and my methodology, right? So it's the overlap of these different senses of the racial value model of the intellectual questions and methodology that go right alongside those questions about identity and language. And that's why it's so important for us not to necessarily separate those in this model, because that's how the students are seeing themselves move throughout that day. So it's really important for us with this model to have good dialogue with faculty. So what we need next is to really continue working on how we as linguists and educators approach students with this information that empowers them linguistically and racially, and really respects their own identity choices throughout our pedagogy and practices. So with this knowledge, we are really already trying to create materials and models that range the Black experience so we can teach and tailor our teaching to them. So I'm going to give you some examples of how this looks in different contexts. We have one wonderful group of scholars, Hannah Franz, Michelle Gruey, Angela Rowell, Sierra Johnson, and Marie Tano, across different universities, across different types of experiences. And we got a grant from the National Council of Teachers of English Conference on College Composition and Communication to develop materials so that students can advocate for the right to their own language in their graded writing. We created a website that has an online guide for writing instructors, but it also has a guide for college students themselves. So both people can see both sets of comments and ideas, but we tailored it for the instructors about ways to comment on African-American English student papers in ways that are culturally sustaining and that allow the students linguistic agency throughout the writing process, from conception and creation of the ideas through feedback, workshops, and revision, that really explains the linguistic choices and the ramifications of those in different contexts. And we really use not just information from our own Talking College project, but wonderful work that Hannah did for her dissertation on K-12 student writing and that overlap between what goes on in K-12 education and in higher education. The website's live and it's open and free, and it has sample graded papers and rubrics and examples of African-American English use in higher education across genres. So there's academic papers, creative, there's all different types of styles. I know the other day I was looking, there's students for government papers, English papers, right? So we're looking at different ways this happens. And then for the college student side, we go through features of African-American English that we know from our research are empirically more used in college student writing, and give them questions to ask their instructors so they can advocate for that feedback. We have info on the feedback and examples of African-American English across genres as part of that. And I'll just show you here how it's laid out. It's really laid out user-friendly. It has the bullets here for the different kind of resources, and then just goes through things that we might have heard ourselves over and over or said, kind of how we have learned to teach and write, and really brings in models from culturally sustaining pedagogies to change that. And so instead of just penalizing through direct corrections or labeling AAE features as informal, confusing, or unclear, we ask questions about students' choices. We use explicit descriptions to help students understand feedback. And we acknowledge alternate audiences and audiences that students really may want to use time in college to create and cultivate their writing ability for. Kendra Calhoun, who was at UCSB Linguistics and is now at UCLA as a postdoctoral fellow, looked at how this ideas and work in college situations right now plays out in online spaces. So she looks at social media and looks at, as particularly Vine, Twitter, and Tumblr, and the ways that students are expressing their ideas, their cultural values in these social media places. So there's no way we could do this project without a really heavy interest in thinking about college students' use of social media. What she does with that is actually triangulate it with diversity discourses and practices in higher education and how they are represented in social media. So this is on college and university websites, on their social media feeds, and thinking about the similarities and the dissonance between those discourse strategies that are used in diversity and inclusion practices and what students really think about them, right? And so this is what's so exciting about today. Really, what she saw was before May 2020, combating anti-Blackness was not necessarily an explicit part of institutional DEI efforts. And linguistic justice is still largely absent. What she said is what she's seen from administrative practices, right? So as we talk about inclusion, and even as we talk about international lenses, the language practices are not really there as frequently. Jeremy Edwards did a lot of work on this project, really thinking about centering Black experiences in course curriculum and instruction. And he's actually now here with me at Stanford, teaching in our first year writing program as we continue to implement this work. What Jeremy was interested in is how students talk about their Black identity at other minority serving institutions. So here in California, we don't have undergraduate HBCUs. There's one historically Black medical campus in Los Angeles, but our students are Black students are embedded in a larger discourse of being minority serving institutions, but those minority serving, that's the government term that I'm using, are Latinx scholars and Asian American scholars. And so students are kind of talking about being in the middle of this discourse, but realizing the discourse is not materially for them. And so students said, just these experiences, they say, while working at the library, I have to be at the front desk and people are talking to me and they'll ask certain questions, but they'll kind of side eye, right? They can understand that people are grappling with these different issues of race and anti-Blackness, right? And so I feel like when I'm not myself, it's just kind of like when I'm watching myself and it's kind of getting torn apart, right? And another student says, because of the lack of a Black discourse in these big California universities, I feel like my Blackness here, it just happened last year. So they're saying like they're just coming into that consciousness. I feel like it wasn't like, oh, hey, Black student, here is everything. It was more like, I'm a Black person. I need to figure this out, everything on my own. It's like I'm part of the Black Student Union or nothing. And like, I felt like the Black people I've met and Black people who were my friends weren't oblivious, right? I didn't see them to the last moment. So the student goes on and talks about the need for that specific focus on Blackness and the Black identity, even within this larger minority serving research university context. Jamal Muwakil is a PhD student at UCSB, and as part of this project was also serving as the UC student regent. So that's the one student that represents the student body in all of the larger conversations of the trustees, the people who really run the UC. Jamal was the chair of the Committee on Student Basic Needs and the Working Group on Former Foster Youth, and had a real big interest in thinking about how our findings overlap with bigger questions of public engagement and investments and the financial and capital strategies that universities are using, especially around the inclusion of Black students. So in those larger public discourse conversations, Jamal's research topics are really focusing in on what does it mean to be Black in the University of California system? And what was this based on? What was the imaginary that formed the discourse? And how does regionality and class inform our ideas about college and Blackness? And how are Black students' understandings of different models of higher education related to the ideas of how they see their belonging, their identity formation, and their ability for achievement on these different campuses? DeAndre, as an interviewer and a practitioner, brings in questions of discourse and the effects of students' experiences becoming through a racial linguistics lens and also a language and gender lens. So DeAndre is looking at the ideas that the current notions of identity in linguistics don't really account for some of these unique histories that we're sharing that affect how Black students employ language to social ends, which is a really crucial element of supporting us, or as he said, us or them, on college campuses. So their thesis looks at the social construction of the racio-gendered imaginary. How do we deal with tropes such as Black women are loud, right? Or how is Blackness embodied as students on campus walk across campus or enter a classroom as part of the ways that we think about our unique and specific histories. So we end the text really thinking about how does this have to be better integrated into scholarship. And I think about this from my person-centered first author lens on the book. My job is to compel Black students to dream bigger, right? It's to make sure they're not grateful for linguistic or educational crumbs that are a result of current practices, so that they're able to center their Blackness at all times and center themselves in their experience in the academy overall. Without that, you have a default sense of extra, lucky to be here. It's a privilege. Not many of us will be here, but I'm just going to get through and make it how I can. And what we're trying to get away from is those discourses being the set frame. So this is just the start of this conversation. We are heavily working on how this will now integrate into a larger conversation across linguistics through our work with the Oxford Collections on Inclusion and Decolonization. So what we're saying is now we're taking this info and this model and trying to say, how do we use it to inform and transform the growth of linguistics as a discipline? So we've invited a lot of authors. I know some of them are here on the Zoom today. And the texts have two different focuses. So we have a focus on inclusion, really building the models in linguistics as we've had, so that inclusion can be through participation, but also through research modeling. We're making a plan for diversity and inclusion for P-12 education, undergraduate education, graduate education, faculty and administration, and starting to reimagine the role of linguistics departments on university campuses as part of this conversation. We take decolonization in many different interpretations, right? So we're thinking about this with indigenous logics, we're thinking about this with Black diasporic logics, and really directly confronting the theoretical and methodological actions of linguists. And one of the things that we talk about is we're just ending fieldwork. We're just thinking about communities in this point and thinking about how we humanize all of the people that have contributed to the ways that linguistic theory and research is done. Christine has a heavy emphasis on ethics as part of that, so that's really throughout this volume. And really imagining linguistic activism right alongside imagining linguistic reparations and a repair. Getting us right back to the initial question that started all this work is, who is this research for? Who's reading it? Who's consuming it? How can it be useful? And to do that, big questions about how do we make this knowledge accessible to different communities? So academia is just really beginning to fully describe the African-American experience. And so coming in through our sociolinguistic lenses, this is just our way of kind of not just contributing, but adding to the model. One of the things we like to think about a lot is, who could you yourself share this information with? And thinking about this specifically, individuals, but also across departments and programs and across universities, will help us flesh out the strategic effectiveness of the work that we've done. So I'm spending a lot of time in Zoom land, zooming all across the country, all across the world, thinking about what the particularities are. So I'm super eager for our question and answer period so we can hone in on some of those issues. And then specifically for our linguists, and when we say linguists, we mean broadly defined. These are scholars across the academy: linguistics, applied linguistics, communication, writing and rhetoric, right? All these different ways that linguistics has been either siloed or come together. How will we all together manifest the most real concept that I know is that Black Lives Matter. So I want to thank our sponsors, so many sponsors, so many people we've been really in conversation with across this project. And I really am excited to hear what y'all have to say and what's been going on in the chat. So I want to thank you all so much.
Amazing. Let's all thank Anne for this wonderful talk. And we have plenty of time for questions. So please feel free to type in the chat or raise your hand. And you can feel free to call on people as they come in. Oh, there's a question there.
A question? Yeah.
Hi, I think it's me. Thank you so much for this. This is amazing. I am at a college where our linguists are together with ESL faculty, and we are just having a really difficult time figuring out how to bring this to our ESL faculty. And some of us are also ESL faculty, but there just is a bigger divide between us on this issue than we anticipated. So I think that some of the linguists came at it unprepared. And so we just kind of came in and we're like, racio-linguistic identities, blah, blah. And they were a little overwhelmed and like, what about academic writing and what are we doing here? So anything you have, suggestions or thoughts would be so appreciated.
I think it's gonna, this is an ongoing process, right? There's not one thing, but I think one of the things we have to look at is helping people understand the difference between their goals for language and communication and the goals that their students may have. And we've gotten a lot of headway by framing it that way, rather than thinking about just the end of the test or the assessment, right? And making that practical reality of, well, what is your student trying to do? Where are they trying to go next? Part of that inquiry. One of the things we know is a lot of the practical aspects of why that's happening and that challenge happens across the ESL and TESOL communities is the test bias, right? And so we got to go and sit down with people and really show where this bias is playing out in assessment, and where assessment bias, just trying to get a good score or whatever on the test, really looks different than communicative and cultural effectiveness in terms of what students are doing. So that's one place, I don't know if you've done some of that yet, Christine, or not, but that's one place where we've made some headway just in the conversation. It's the Big Next Challenge. I just was elected to the Center for Applied Linguistics Board of Trustees, and I feel like I'm going to spend the next couple of years taking that exact question head on logically, because if you just look at the assessments that people are using and selling, like there's no way around that. And that's, again, if you think about where people are caught in the model, most people we are talking about, they're just trying to get through the day, right? They're just trying to do what their job is. And so we have to work with them together to really say, okay, we need to have some conversations about what's going on in this assessment or this rubric, or even some of the ways that the ESL textbooks describe to students, like how they should be thinking about English as part of that process. And I think if you can get that collaborative conversation going, that'll kind of help us steer towards change. But I'm not gonna lie, that's a formidable task that many of my students have been involved in. And that testing structure really makes it challenging to crack. I'm happy to take questions live or in the chat. I'm just looking up the chat to see if I missed anything.
Hi, I have a question. There wasn't any other, so so as a white settler descendant colonial person with international students and diverse students, do you have any advice on how to start these discussions in my classes, in intralinguistics classes? I'm right now teaching a class with a lot of justice study, intralinguistics with lots of justice studies. So like some people want to be police officers and stuff when they graduate. And so I want them, and a lot of them are people of color, immigrants, and different things. So, but I want them to think about language in their future careers and think critically about it, but I'm also very conscious of who I am and the ways I can talk about it that are different than the ways maybe you could talk about it in class.
We really advocate for an expanded model and practice of the linguistic autobiography as a way for a couple of things to happen. And this is it's in the book. It's really like laid out. Number one, to spend more time getting to know the students in your class and their own cultural linguistic histories, but also to position yourself as a learner of them. So I think especially, you know, for white scholars is saying, you know, I'm going to share a lot of info with you, but you're going to share a lot of info with me, right? So it's transitioning more into that facilitative role. And again, then going into some of the aspirations. So if students are in justice studies, figuring out why they came to be in that place. What are some of the goals they have with that? So that you can start to look at some of the literature about the ways that language plays a role in justice in criminal justice system. We have good research now on things in courtrooms, everything from courtroom translation to mistranslation, to the ability of lawyers to use rhetoric to sway juries in cases, and the way that media even plays a role in that right now, right? That students can bring in and see the ways that language move through the legal and justice space. I always have lawyers come into my courses, especially when I'm teaching things like language attitudes, to really think about even the language of the law. How does the language of the law itself construct some of these issues and identities? And as students then bring in those histories of why they came to justice studies, you're gonna most likely, you know, again, be in learner mode as they start to share things that have happened to them in their own life. My students here in education, we talk about this a lot in the US in the frame of carceral logics. So all the ways that we as Black people have been policed, but the ways that our bodies have been policed, the ways that our language have been policed. And if you come at it through that empathetic kind of experiential, I think you may be able to have students learn really the material importance of thinking about language, from everything to saying how the law was constructed, to then how they will implement their everyday practices, either as, I mean, everything. I've had some of everyone in my courses, students who've gone on to be attorneys, students who've gone on to work in schools where there's a lot of justice issues and challenges that happen there. And I have students who work in international translation law, right? And thinking about how patents and trademarks kind of influence the ways that we think about language and intellectual property and copyright and possession. So there's a wide ways of thinking about that. But when you bring in that facilitative element, I think that's really important. And Christine, who was on, I think she's on here still, but Christina has done a lot of work working with judges in particular and getting this linguistic bias. And then that inspired me to start working with some judges in the juvenile justice system. One that I want to highlight that just based on your question that it always sticks with me is, I don't know in Canada, but in the United States, even if you get a parking ticket and you have to go in to court, one of the first things that the judge will ask the officer, and this happened to me when I got a parking ticket, was the person nice in the exchange? Like literally just asking a general like cultural ethos thing. And that officer has to say, yes, they were really polite and respectful through the whole exchange. Well, right there, that's starting off the linguistic and cultural nightmare about how you experience like this police officer. And the judge never asked, at least in my case, was the police officer nice to me, right, during the exchange, right? That is already presumed. So there's just so many aspects of where the stuff we're talking about overlaps with justice experiences. And we didn't focus on that in this study, but it could be the whole thing, just even people on this study's experiences with criminal justice, because you are not necessarily, I mean, there's very few Black people in America who haven't had a direct experience, myself definitely included, with criminal justice in one way or the other, just by the material of trying to get through your day. So that's a kind of long answer, but Christine's saying you're happy to email her more questions if you want to hear more about that from the work that she's done with the judges.
Thank you.
And Christine Jacknick says, definitely check out John Baugh's book, Linguistics and the Pursuit of Justice, as you kind of think about your class materials. It's a great example. I see hands in the participant list, but I don't see them on the screen. So I think I'll just go up to the top. Rhonda?
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I also want to say that if Black languages are understudied in America, they're like virtually absent in Canada. The dialogue around it is so limited. So I think I speak for everyone here in Canada to say thank you. Thank you so much. So the first thing that I want to ask you is a question that I hear a lot in non-racialized spaces with ESL teachers. And they'll say things like, oh, well, I would love to include more dialect variation, but I'm just not familiar with that language or with that type, so I don't feel comfortable. So I like to ask scholars this because I'm curious as to how you respond to those things.
Well, what I often respond with empathy, that we really haven't done a great job of tailoring the language variety context information. So not just laying it out in a way that, an undergraduate, can really understand, but contextualizing it. So we need materials for people in criminal justice. We need to think about materials for languages for people from ESL, right? So I would say to them, you know what, we really do need to build these specific guides. That's how we got to making the writing guide, right? Because the writing instructors don't need everything about African-American English. They need the stuff that's going to come up in a writing class, in a writing situation in college. So I start with the empathy, and then I go for materials that in that conversation of building empathy would be most pertinent. So in the ESL literature, there are some people who are doing some great overlap work, but I do still think there's space for just some general information. And that's not a space that I've written as much for, but we have done it for writing. We've done it for speech and hearing at this point. In this text, we really do it in terms of what college students are interested in. So I could see this as a project that students could work with you on and get done pretty effectively, like that's tailored to that particular group and their interests. Because I think that tailoring is just key. Like we have tons of general stuff and there's videos and everything, right? But it's that specificity. How does this play out a little bit in my situation that makes that relevant? Good question though. All the materials we have to think we still have a shortage, but that's how I feel every day. Mark.
Hello, my name is Mark. I'm an English teacher at Valencia College in Orlando. There's several of us from there who are here today. So I really appreciate your talk. My question is, well, let me try to lead to it, but hopefully it won't take me very long. First, I just want to say that I was really happy to hear about how sort of detailed and granular your understanding is of the power structures that exist in academic institutions. I think that we tend to think of power structures as being well, maybe, sometimes professors hold them, or sometimes that they're somewhere in the administration, but you really look at it from across the discipline. And at my college today, my colleagues and I, we had an in-service day where we were sort of teaching different types of, facilitating different types of sessions to each other. And one of my colleagues here and I were doing a workshop on anti-racism, and we were talking about, the importance of finding friends and allies and being able to kind of like work upward. And I noticed that in a sense, you're really talking both sort of at all different levels of the power structure. And I guess the question that I have for you is like, what do you see as the how optimistic or hopeful are you about being able to sort of like I'll use the word that you used a little bit earlier, like not just simply assimilate people into power structures, but to reform and reformulate those power structures in vastly different ways. From where I stand, my vantage point, I work as an adjunct. And so I am very far outside of the power structure system. And the only way that, for example, we've been able to try to fight for that system is we just want a union for ourselves. But that's a hard road to plow. And so, yeah, I tried to do that in graduate school. I was trying to win a union for grad students, and so like it's, trying to sort of alter these power dynamics is extremely hard. And I wonder, from your vantage point, at a place like Stanford University, I started organizing as a grad student when I was a graduate student at Yale. They're extremely sort of, very unfriendly to the idea of sharing any kind of power with graduate students or anybody else. So from your vantage point, like, how hopeful or optimistic are you about, it seems like you've had a lot of success with the work that you are doing, bringing students in, but what about transforming these, these power structures that can, really fundamentally affect and alter the kinds of experiences and trajectories and values around the work that you do?
I would say a couple different angles on it to see if it makes sense. So I am a card-carrying member of the American Federation of Teachers, and I have worked with them throughout their career from the time that I was a graduate student to work that we're doing with them constantly. And everyone always used to say to me, be careful of that, right? You're going to not get certain jobs. I sat in one dean's office saying, I don't know if I can hire you because you're so active in the unions. And I was like, you know what? This is how it's going to go, right? It's going to be that way. So I know the material costs that you doing that work, and even to my own career, that would take. But I have to go back to my Southern organizing roots, is to understand that there are more of us than there are of them, right? And at a certain point, the thing that we need to do in the university, whether it's through unions or other models, is really sit and look at those structures and have those organizational conversations. So I was optimistic about it when I started, but the work that we've done in the last couple of years to get that organized in linguistics, like, it was past what we can imagination. It went from, for me, thinking, okay, well, if we're in that power structure, the thing we can control as adjuncts and junior faculty and grad students is our curricular content, right? That's why we have so much focus on that curricular content. Curricular content then became conversations with editors, conversations with publishers about what we were just going to start publishing, what we were going to change in the discourse. That then turned into more edited collections and things where people really couldn't ignore the conversation, largely thanks to my large graduate student population, but graduate students all around the country who started organizing and getting me on the department talk list, right? So one of the things that they really used was the fact that in many colloquium, people ask for graduate students. So I got wind of this at first, and then I realized my grad students were hustling, right? They are organizers on the as the truest sense. Once those conversations opened up, I went from my allies, that Mary Boco's group of late stage associate into full white women who've been in situations often of, relative oppression, but have some agency and have some organizational skills. So our model with that is practical, right? And thinking about the conversations that they're in, conversations that I'm in, and ways that we can start to sway department votes, sway agendas in the Linguistic Society of America, and have this thing be all organized out. So you cannot like it, you cannot participate, but I would say my optimism grows right now because you cannot ignore it, right? And this is the fundamental conversation and where I feel we are in linguistics. If you choose to not participate in the conversation, that's great, but you can't ignore the conversation anymore. We have called the question. That's where we are. So I would love to hear, Mark, now that we've called the question, as we keep going with this, what's next? And I think the biggest call to question that we're seeing now is the job ads out of Stanford, the job ads out of UCLA, the job ads out of Michigan, right? When these students now go into these jobs, that's going to change those conversations in those departments for the next 20, 30 years. And so my job on the other end of that, just like chapter 5 of the book, is to keep that conversation going down the structural line. So that's kind of how I've seen it. I come from old school Black Southern integrationists. My mother integrated Vanderbilt. My father sued to be in the neighborhood that I'm in. They sued the state medical board for privileges in the local white hospitals. So I'm just adapting that model to higher ed, and I'm transparent about it.
Thank you so much. That's really inspiring. It's awesome. I wish there were more professors that had that kind of, like use of organizing skills. So thank you.
Yeah, great question. What work have we done with reparation groups, advocates, and activists? So most of our work has been centered around teacher organizations, or in the states we're in where you can't even have so we work with teacher unions where there are unions, teachers organize in other ways where they can or not, and really helping teachers see how they do this on the ground. And that's a daily activity for me. I mean, I had teachers texting me this morning at 7 a.m. trying to think about some of the strategies in their schools. So that's where most of our work has lied. And for me, it's always been then about student activism and student activists. So students, some of the photos that you've seen, right? These are students who are actively working in Virginia system, in the California system and state, for me in my instance, for change, not just at the university, but in the structural system of how higher education is done in those states. And so that's kind of, for me, that's my direct work. Those students are activists. You know, before Charlottesville, the only thing I said was somebody is going to get killed. Like, it was getting that active in Virginia. And that woman, Heather Heyer, I wrote an article about it because she was 1 degree removed from me, but directly connected to my colleagues. And one of my colleagues who runs the Ron Brown Foundation, which is a huge foundation that's designed to get Black students into more high resource universities. And she worked in that building. So these are activists who are out marching, protesting. One of the pictures I showed in the slideshow, I was kind of making sure I get through all the content, so I'll come back to it now. The photos that I use are of student activists. So they are really thinking about, this is one when we were heavily involved in Black Lives Matter conversations at the College of William and Mary, right here, and just staged in large protests. So I'm out there, and sometimes I'm the tenured faculty member who's showing up, who's laying down, and here at Stanford, you know, pushing the way I just got here, but pushing that angle with my new cohort of Black students to think about what we're doing curricularly, what we're doing in terms of serving students. So that's how my activism has always gone, because I've always been in that school integration space. Let's see, I see another question in the chat. So now we're acting a lot with smart AI assistants. Pedagogy is also using AI. What about the reparations in this context? So Jalen Pittman in my group here, this is a focus of his work. So you'll have to have him come give a talk. He's in the first group of racial justice AI and computer science fellows here at Stanford. And he was a Yale linguistics undergrad and was at UCSB with me working on these issues, and now is here. I think we've got to do a lot. I mean, as we think about the questions of the justice models of algorithms, that's important. But Jalen is actually sending in on lexical questions about validity of large data sets, and is emphasizing student names. So even just things about the ways that students interact with the materials that are now being created for their learning, because the materials even say and process and understand them on that basic humanizing point, which is just to be able to say the name, is something that he's been working about. But I do think there's going to be a lot of questions about reparations here at Stanford and here in Silicon Valley, just in terms of inclusion of people in the rooms who are making those decisions. We have the REU that I was running, the HBC REU in the UC, has moved to Stanford, and we're taking I'll be taking my first students this summer here to really start delving in that intersection between what we're saying, the different ways that we are now doing linguistics on this campus. So I'll have to say, stay tuned for Jalen's work, and stay tuned for that as we get that going. Douglas.
Sorry, I had to unmute. Thank you so much for your talk. I'm doing a lot of work with Ella Rayner, who's in this meeting. We're both at Valencia with Mark. And we're talking a lot now about, I saw it on one of your slides, industry, linguistic diversity in industry, and thinking specifically about reparations. Could you talk a little bit about how you teach or talk about reparations in terms of corporations, employing Black language, really linguistic variation, making top dollar off of it, but then still policing it or policing it out in terms of hiring practices. And then of course in education, you can't do that and succeed. And yet that's complete falsehood, because all corporations in America and Canada are making money off of it. So I just wondered if you could speak a little bit about how you teach that or approach that.
I approach it in a couple of different ways. I mean, so I could teach classes, obviously now if you've seen in my model, about the structure of institutions and that relationship with corporate structure. My last position at UC Santa Barbara, I was the vice chair of budget and planning for the university. So I go really deep in detail about how does this relationship between education and industry kind of create the modern university, especially these modern big universities. And so what I'm hoping is we can look at those corporate university interest kind of conversations as a way to get it started on both sides. So what are people funding? Who are not in those development rooms? Who's not on those fundraising teams or on those large grant body teams? And at least for me, trying to write some of this reality into those bigger models. And I've done that at every university I've been at, including working on that here. And I think in industry, what we've really got to do is help people get to the point about actions we'd like to see taken and the empirical evidence for why those would be really important, and just work down the list, right? Because getting the larger context and the larger kind of framework, that's great, but I'm not really thinking that everyone's going to have the time or energy for that. So we need to kind of be direct. There's a couple ways you could do that as professors, right? Start to think about internships and relationships that you can have with students. So in my previous position at College of William and Mary, when I was running the William and Mary Scholars Program, I was meeting with execs from different industries, really talking about the importance of them hiring and having my students in as interns and understanding what they were getting from our program, but also how the program can really be informed by the things that, really were at the forefront of the inclusion initiatives of those programs, right? So we were still talking about inclusion, but I did, and I'm still here, obviously, thinking about that within the realities of corporate structure and what needs to change, and preparing my students for that reality. So I have students who go into all kinds of industry. Most of my students are not linguists by far, right? But I think we got to look at what's going on. So students out here in particular were really interested in, one of the examples we use a lot is the Crown Act. I mean, we're still on the basic where you can't be Black and wear your hair where you want to in different corporations. And we're thinking about that with thinking about how you express your identity in corporate spaces and how can we move forward, especially the ways traditionally in the United States that Black people felt they had to really change almost everything to be accepted in a corporate structure. What's different, what's changing, who's leading those conversations, I think is a way to kind of get at that. And who are corporate models? So I think about like Wharton now has a Black dean, right? That's started a lot of conversations about inclusion. Stanford Business Schools had started a whole Black Leadership Institute where they're talking about these things in the next level. And I've been going to some of those. So my brother went to Stanford Business School and thinking about, how different those conversations are now, even than 5 or 10 years ago. So really starting to see who's pushing the angles on some of that stuff right now, I think is a really good thing for your students to be informed in so they can decide where they want to be on that structure. That is also to say that even within my models in linguistics, but also just as I think about it, I got to make sure my students can be employed. So I see that also as another form of reparations, is that I talk a lot about money and budgets and finances and how to get a job, like in life, because many of my students are first generation. They may come from lower income backgrounds. Their primary goal of going to college is still economic security and some sense of mobility, right? So I don't leave that out in the way that I'm framing even the linguistics or the context of being at college.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. With the chat, see if I missed anything. Christine's adding links. This will be recorded and we'll put it up as soon as we get the recording. Yes, Morgan.
Hi.
Hi.
Sorry, as long as no one else has a question, I was sort of struggling to think how to formulate this. So I guess it's just, so in our department, like most linguistics departments, we have a large introductory class that's currently 1 semester, and some other departments it's 2 semesters. And I think we're probably not unlike a lot of other programs at this point in North America, and certainly in Canada, in that it's, there's very little even social linguistic component in it currently, much less, I mean, things are sort of frozen in time in terms of language use. And I think just that's more from inertia than anything else, right? Like a lot of things in academia. So I guess what I'm trying to think of is just changing this course going forward, whether it's by adding whole new units or just develop it. Like, how can I change the course to incorporate some of these ideas? Or like, I guess it feels like a lazy question, is sort of where's a model I can look at? I was just sort of looking at your books. I was trying to see, like, maybe in your book with Talking College, there's good examples of this, but just it can be sort of overwhelming, especially as the first person said, I don't, given my obvious background, I don't necessarily feel that qualified to know what the sort of right things are to emphasize.
So Kendra has a lot of her materials that are just open as part of her project. I'll put her link in the chat. And one of the things that we did is saying, look, some people are going to run this as a whole class, others are going to take parts of it, right, and include it. And then one of my former students, who is now at Berkeley as the director of undergrad studies, Peter Jenks, we worked together like pre-pandemic. I went to Berkeley and we were like thinking about what do you integrate in that larger course. And so Peter is actually in that article, like talking about the adaptation, right? It's like the whole course wasn't going to be Black Study centered, but he could change things around. And one of the things that I've been doing my whole career is put the sociolinguistics first, right? The traditional linguistics books that I was educated on had it last. And if we ran out of time, we didn't even get to it in a lot of the kind of the universities I was at. And so he was talking about the ways that you can show up front that this student is for a lot of people. And then the other model I want to super highlight is our colleagues at Toronto, who really have been taking some of our models and making them multilingual and really adapting them to Canada. And Nathan Sanders in particular has been leading that effort. He has a paper in our new Inclusion in Linguistics book that's just excellent, kind of talking about how it started as a conversation and then it started kind of going through the department in different ways. And now it's become a conversation on their campus. So I visited with them a couple, last year, but just this academic year. And we were just kind of thinking about how that incrementally now has gone through their curriculum. In the inclusion book, we have models of this for formal syntax and semantics coming from Penn and Florian Schwartz. We've got it coming through historical linguistics with Claire Bowen at Yale and Rickard Dock at Swarthmore. So I don't think it's lazy at all to say, there's a whole scholarship of building these models and then sharing them and seeing how you would adapt pieces that make sense for different courses, because it's definitely taken a lot of work to develop them. Christine, were there any more in the text you wanted me to highlight? Yeah. Oh, you're welcome. Yeah. I was trying to think of others in the text. That was the ones I was assigned to. We split up the editorship, so it's a lot going on in these collections. Yep, she said those are great examples. Okay. Now, and Morgan, to your question too, just to think about it, like some of that's on the undergraduate. A lot of what I've been focusing on is how do we change our graduate curriculum? So talk about fixed in time. I don't even think there's been a lot of academic conversations in linguistics as a whole of what are we doing on the grad level. That's content wise, but also like preparing our students to be educators, researchers, and kind of having some sense of that. And I'm really a big student of that because some of our adjacent disciplines have had a lot more conversation about those graduate curriculums. So that's another way to come at this with our graduate students, which is what we've been doing, is thinking about their experience and then how that's reflected in the undergraduate curriculum. Robert.
Good afternoon and thank you. Any thoughts on how to work with faculty in workforce training programs on this concept?
I haven't done too much on that. Christine, you want to jump in on that one?
I didn't actually hear that. Could you say it again? Yeah. It was a little quiet.
That's more.
Sorry.
Robert,
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Robert's asking about thinking about adapting this into workforce training. And I just think about the students that you work with. That's really a good angle.
That's a great question. I'm sorry I'm not on camera. I've got kid duty simultaneously. So sorry about that. So yeah, workforce training is great. We have a lot of students in our program who do things like we had someone go work for the census. This was really important, having some knowledge of linguistic diversity. We have folks who go on to be principals of or folks who already are principals and who want to move up into the school system. We've had folks who work for nonprofits. We had someone who became a superintendent of a school system as well. I'm trying to think of other examples off the top of my head, but I think, you know, I'm very fortunate to have students from a wide interdisciplinary background. And I feel like language, you know, I tell them all the time, language is relevant to everything, to policy, to law, to the arts, you know, to everything in between. And I think, you know, if we can get more of those applied examples out there, that students will be able to see themselves in that work. So I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, in Virginia, our We Do Language book was embedded within a college and career readiness program. And so the workforce angle that I come from was thinking about how this applies in high school settings and situations for students who are going to enter the workforce right after. So I put that link in the chat so you can see that overview. And there we just started to identify what are some of the linguistic skills that you would need, right? That you would need to have gotten in high school to really be effective in that first level of workforce. So I think just because Christine and I, most of this work was done at regional public universities, have kind of come at different angles from that. But I wanted to highlight both because I know that's a question that we've had a lot. A lot of Christine students are in workforce. That's how they're thinking about their education. Whereas mine has been more the teacher-centered model of sending students into the workforce.
All right, thanks.
Yeah.
Right, we are right at about 5 o'clock here in Montreal. So let's all thank Anne again for this amazing presentation and for all of the resources. There are some in the chat. This is recorded and we will have it up somewhere once we figure out where to put it. So we will send out some news on that. And yes, let's start use our clap function. I can't find my clap function, so I'll clap in real life.
That's so good. Your questions are so great. It's got us thinking. We're working on the next book, so it'll be, you know, part of how we're thinking about this, and that is talking faculty. So we've got NSF funding to look at the linguistic experiences of Black college faculty. I had so much to say today, I couldn't even say that till the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for coming.
Bye,